Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Adult Sunday School with the Goldendale Church of the Nazarene. And if you are watching this is January 31st, 2021, and we will be discussing this material on February 7th, 2021. I had a hard time keeping that straight. In fact, I had to start this recording over because I got confused. So I apologize. It's not the most straightforward thing, I know. But let's go ahead and get started without further ado. But I wanted to just tell you that based on some conversation we had in our class this last Sunday, I thought we should go on a little bit of a rabbit trail and start talking or just go over a little bit about atonement theory through the ages, some of the nuances, because I will say one of the problems that we have in our Western kind of mind, and by Western, I mean Western civilization, starting kind of with the Greek-Roman tradition and going on into our modern day, and certainly Western Europe, North America. We pretty much have that mindset, right, where we want things to be precise. We want one definition for every term, every word, every concept has to mean one thing. And it is not necessarily so. The Hebrew language is a lot more vibrant in a way. It has fewer words, but each word carries a lot of baggage intentionally, because there are a lot of nuances to what things mean. And certainly when you're talking about God and theology, his plans and purposes, his nature, it's not something we can capture in a simple word or a definition. Yeah, he's bigger than that. So I wanted to kind of go over some of this atonement theory stuff, and maybe that will help clarify it. I think it's important because for us to really understand what Vail is telling us about God's intent and purposes for all of creation, I think we need to think a little bigger about some of the concepts that we've become very accustomed to over time. So let me go ahead, get rid of me. Let's go ahead and begin. So here we are on lesson 4, and I've just called it atonement because it kind of is off on a rabbit trail. But let's go ahead and see what we wind up saying. All right, first of all, I'm going to quote Vail a couple of times from page 10. You've already seen these. He defines salvation as the preservation or granting of life in the face of deadly or life-grinding circumstances. So doesn't that pretty much carry the connotation of rescue, right? Being rescued from something. Certainly, we would say salvation is rescue from our sinful state, our fallen state, our future that doesn't really look all that great because it's not a future that includes God. And then atonement, he defines this way. He says it's foundational to salvation. So in other words, without atonement, salvation doesn't really have a point. If Jesus didn't do what he did, how would he save us? It's sort of like if you're drowning in the middle of the lake, I might really want to save you, but I can't unless I can swim, right? Unless I have some capabilities that are sufficient to the task. So Jesus's work on the cross and then his resurrection were those foundational works. They were sufficient to the task of salvation. But for Vail, he defines atonement as the reconciling work God is doing to bring us into right fellowship with God and neighbor. And only through atonement, being restored in the Lord, can creation enjoy abundant life. So you see there, he's talking again about reconciliation and restoration. So that's what he has to say, but let's now spend just a little bit of time going over some theories of atonement. And I got a lot of the quotes and just the kind of layout and material from a really interesting lecture that I listened to online. It's 2 Nazarene pastors just chatting. They call it Convos Over Coffee. They're just having a conversation over coffee. This is the Gallatin Church of the Nazarene, and I put the link in there so that you can watch this. I'll put it in the description as well, so maybe you can just click on it. But it's definitely worth watching. you'll recognize, if you listen to it, a lot of this material that I'm going to be citing. One thing that they say is what happened on the cross is ultimately a mystery, and I think that is very important for us to understand. We think we know what Jesus did on the cross, what his death affected on the cross, what his pain and agony and separation from God, what those things accomplished. We probably don't know anywhere near what it really meant. It's a mystery to us. We just don't know. And so there are many doctrines of atonement, and there have been over the centuries, as we'll see. They're really only theories, though. They may call themselves doctrines, but they're not really, because nobody really knows. Now, here are the examples that I've collected from over the centuries. The first one comes out of medieval Christianity, the Middle Ages. Ransom theory. So in other words, this would involve tricking Satan. Jesus dies on the cross to pay the ransom. Well, if you're paying a ransom, you're paying it to somebody. Who would that somebody be? Well, Satan, I guess. A lot of times in the Middle Ages especially, they believed that it was Satan who had essentially taken ownership of us, and it was through the crucifixion that God tricked Satan. Satan thought that he won when he saw Christ die, but in reality, he lost. So that's kind of ransom theory. But that whole translation thing, it's based on the way the Greek translation worked, and it used the prisoner of war model. So in other words, if you had a war in those days, to get your soldiers back, you had to pay a ransom. So that was kind of coming out of the Greek translation and the Greek way of thinking. And the famous quote that I think many of us know is Mark 10:45, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Well, many of us know, I look it up in the dictionary, I know what a ransom is. But is that really how it should have been translated? I honestly really can't tell you, because if we look at the word that is used right there, in Greek, it's lutron, L-U-T-R-O-N. It does translate as ransom, but if you dig into that definition a little bit, or the way the word lutron is used in Greek, it relates to setting free, or something to loosen with. So not necessarily something that involve a transaction, right? A ransom involves an exchange. I give you money, you give me my whatever back. Lutron does not necessarily imply that there is a transaction, but it talks about setting free or loosening. Definitely in keeping with some of the ideas that we've been talking about in class. And also in the Middle Ages, we had two great thinkers, Anselm and Aquinas. They sort of promoted this satisfaction theory. And I won't go into great detail, but the basis of it is that God's honor must be satisfied, that human beings have fallen, they've done terrible things, and God created us, right? So his honor is being impugned. He needs to have a way to put that back on the right footing. And apparently the crucifixion does that. So that's the satisfaction theory. Agree with it or not. Now, William Tyndale came along in the time of Henry VIII, and he invented the word atonement to this is kind of the key in our discussion in class, because he rendered the Hebrew word. And you remember the Hebrew words in writing did not have vowels, so it was CPR or CFR, and we might recognize that in the word Yom Kippur. The word Kippur has that CPR, KPR kind of thing. He made up the word at-one-man as a way of describing what he thought was going on there, that it was what Jesus' work on the cross was, repairing the breach in the relationship between God and man. Now, I pulled this off of a site with a guy named Harry Friedman. I kind of just like the quote. I have no idea much about his background. Nothing much is said there. But I thought it was interesting how he said it. Creative as it was, Tyndale's translation does not convey the full meaning of the Hebrew root. It occurs elsewhere to mean a ransom, a village, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, and a young lion. In Rabbinic Hebrew, kafar bikar means someone who rejects the Jewish faith. In Islam, the word kafir is an unbeliever. So in other words, it is a very difficult word to explain properly, let alone to translate. So there you go. I think that's really kind of typical in a way of a lot of our theological terms. If we really look into the Hebrew roots of these words, we find that they are not simple. They don't have one definition. Remember how I said in the very beginning, we Western mind people, we love to have precise, simple, unique definitions for words, and this is a very good example, because this KPR or KFR looks to me like it can mean its opposite. It can mean something, it can also mean the opposite. So it's something protected, but it's also something excluded. Very, very interesting. So what can I say? I'm not going to give you the answer because I don't think there is one. But I think what you have to do here is just think about that. Let it sink in. Because this is a very key term for us as Christians. And we do want to make sure that we don't box ourselves in by thinking we know what it means, when really, as I was quoting earlier, what Jesus did on the cross is ultimately a mystery. We don't know every aspect of it. Now here we go, along comes the Reformation, and we all know about the Protestant Reformation, and this thought is particularly from John Calvin more so than Martin Luther. Penal substitutionary atonement. Now, penal has to do with penalty, or, like jail, penal colonies, whatever. Substitutionary means in the place of, and atonement meaning what? Whatever we've decided atonement means. So, as opposed to earlier when Aquinas and Anselm were saying God's honor needed to be satisfied, what Calvin is saying is God's justice must be satisfied, because it would not be fair for people who live in a way that rejects God, that offends God, that's appalling to God, would be on equal footing in the end of it all, right, with the people who had lived for God. There needs to be some kind of justice, in other words. And I would say that many of us kind of feel that way, right? We always want the hero, the good guy, to win. It really bothers us when the bad guy wins. And I know I don't like books and movies where the bad guy wins. So, and I think I'm not alone in that. So this has actually greatly influenced the development of Christian thought, or at least in the Protestant tradition, for many, many centuries, since that first was put forward in the early days of the Protestant Reformation. But as we've already seen, we have to be really careful when we start making assumptions about what the crucifixion meant. So let's take a look here. That we have to remember, too, the cross is not the basis of our faith. The resurrection is. And all this talk about atonement, we always focus on the crucifixion and what that meant, and how that affected us and all that. But as Paul said, and I didn't put the reference here, but it's a famous verse, and I'm sure you know it. If Christ has not risen, you are still dead in your sins. Your faith is futile. And that's basically what this is saying right here, right? If we put all our faith in the crucifixion, that's not getting us anywhere. It's not getting us anywhere until the resurrection occurs. Death is defeated and the law is overcome. Christ does that. That is the great thing that Christ does. He brings life out of death. So what is that really telling us in the long run? Is that God is redemptive, not retributive. He would have, if he was trying to be retributive, why would he even resurrect Christ? That doesn't sound like retribution. to me. No, Christ underwent some kind of chastisement. I am not sure entirely what went on there. But in the long run, what happened? He was resurrected. God is redemptive. That is God's heart. So here are just a few final thoughts I wanted to leave you with. It's a quote from Vail in his other book, Atonement and Salvation, page 95. Our scale-based system is not a true picture of God because God is love. So in other words, we have this meritocracy thing going on, the scale-based system. This is what happens if you're good. This is what happens if you're not. It's not a true picture of God. We don't know how God's love is going to work through the final times. So I think for us, we just have to dig into this a little bit with more of an open mind. It's more helpful to us if we don't think we already know the answer. Then we're just going to find scriptures that support what we already believe. And I will tell you, if you really start looking into some of this stuff, some of the scriptures don't seem to fit very well with what we think we already know. And I'm going to give you that as homework. I think you should just kind of look at that for yourself. Now, the second thing I wanted to say is Jesus' death is representative substitution. So he is a representative for all of us. He substituted himself for us, took our place, not just on the cross, but on the resurrection. Don't forget that. The key is the resurrection. He is the fruit. Now I can't talk. I'm so excited I can't even talk. He is the first fruits. Now, you can look at 1 Corinthians 15:20 there. And this is the Apostle Paul. But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So fallen asleep is a synonym or perhaps a euphemism for dead. Christ has risen from the dead, showing that that is God's heart and God's plan to raise people back from the dead, raise them out of death and into life. And that would include spiritual death, right? Raise them from spiritual death to spiritual life. That's kind of what salvation is for us, right? We're spiritually dead and we become spiritually alive. That is God's heart. He doesn't want anyone to perish. He wants all to come to repentance. Just remember that. And then finally, my last point is salvation is relational. It's not transactional. It's restoring the relationship that we are to have with God. The